And we're back on Second Street talking about government taxes and fees that go into the cost of a new home. Before the break, we were talking about all these municipal charges that are getting built into the cost of new homes. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about the federal government's GST. Uh, Jay, I was surprised about this. I think it was about a year or so ago when I read this, that the threshold in which you pay the GST on a new home, it was set back in the 90s, wasn't it? It hasn't changed.
That's right. That's right. It was set way back. It hasn't changed. And, we talk about the GST. Obviously, the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, came out with a proposal which would be for houses under $1 million to take off the GST for those new builds. And so if you're buying a new build, let's say right at $1 million, that's significant. That's $50,000. And, if the provinces were to follow, for example, I'm here in Ontario, we have the same thing at the provincial level. If the province were to follow and you took the whole PST and GST off here, it's called the harmonized sales tax. You take that off. You're talking about well over $100,000. That's $130,000 that a new homeowner would be paying. That all of a sudden they don't have to pay, and so that does a heck of a lot to improve affordability to allow people to get there.
Mm.
Because when you see a sticker price on a new build home, and actually, the very first home that my wife and I lived in, it was a new build townhouse in the city of Guelph. And we were excited when we saw the price. When we realized and factored in how much we were going to have to pay for that sales tax on top of it, we weren't quite as excited as we were. And of course, you have to figure out your whole array of affordability, because that completely changes the ball game. And so, what Pierre Poilievre
Yeah.
is bringing out is a smart idea, and I think the provinces should follow as well.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what's worse is when you think about what Ottawa does with the money, but that's a whole other subject. Scott, $450,000. This threshold was set in the 90s.
Mhm.
Back in the 90s, a house that cost $450,000. I mean, that would be a totally different home than what you can buy, today in 2024. How did we get how did we progress for 30 years and Ottawa didn't raise that threshold with inflation? Um, how did that occur? Any thoughts on how we got to this state?
I think we've been taking housing for granted nationally and provincially for the better part of 30 years. And it
Yeah.
feels and seems to me that we've only really started paying attention in the last five, once things got out of control and almost in many markets past the point of, I think, no return without a serious correction.
Yeah.
I don't know why it hasn't been updated. This is something I go to meetings regularly in Ottawa to meet with MPs, and typically one of the top three things we talk about is the GST on housing, on new housing, and particularly either get rid
Yeah.
of it altogether, which is the best way to go, or to at least
Mhm.
update the
Yeah.
threshold, which makes no sense in a modern day reality. And I don't really have a good answer as to or explanation. I've never been provided as to why that hasn't been looked at or updated, even just based on inflation.
Yeah, well, it's appalling that it hasn't been updated in 30 some
Mhm.
years. Um, you suggest taking the threshold off altogether, just not having the GST on homes, period. Uh, Jay, what's your take? Should it be a case where the threshold gets raised, as Mr. Poilievre is promising, or do you agree with Scott that the GST should just simply be taken off of the cost of homes, period?
I agree with Scott. I think housing is fundamental. I think if you're having a new build, it's obviously, you're building a new home, and the sales tax should be taken off, period. Obviously, right now, I think federally they're trying to make the calculation in their heads. Well, how much is this going to mean in terms of revenue not brought in? Because of course, that's why the threshold hasn't adjusted since the 1990s.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the reasons is they haven't been thinking about it, but the other is it's been a cash cow. And of course, so this is one of the reasons why they don't want to do it. And so that cap of $1 million, probably the proposal is actually just because they want to keep a lot of that revenue. But I think
Mhm.
fundamentally there should not be a tax on housing, period. If someone
Mm.
buys a $5 million home that's not new, they're not paying that tax. Whereas you're building, say, a $1.5 million home that is new, why should you have to pay sales tax on top of that? So, fundamentally, I think it should be taken off.
Yeah. Is there an argument though that someone who's buying like a $10 million house that, taking it off is subsidizing the rich. I'll just ask you, what's your take on that, Jay?
Well, look, if you're buying a 10, 20, $30 million home that already exists, you're not paying sales tax on it. So why should you have to with a new build home? I think it's just discouraging home building, and it's fundamentally unfair.
Okay, listen, when we come back, we're going to be talking about the land transfer tax, another fun tax to pay when you have to buy a new house. We'll be back in just a moment.